Our next speaker is Alex Balch, and I'll let him explain exactly what he's going to talk about.
Right, so I was given 10 minutes. I'll try and even beat 10 minutes. And I was told 5 points, but I might go 6. And I'm not sure I'm going to be able to stop on a positive note. But I'll try and crack a few jokes at the end. But it's not a particularly positive moment, because we're talking about the end of free movement, and I'm going to talk about the ending of free movement and what that means in terms of the shift towards immigration, and then the argument that this will lead to modern slavery. Now, my work is studying all of these issues. I'm going to try and condense this into sort of a fairly quick run through. But basically, the argument is that from the 1st of January 2021, free movement ends. We know that. But what comes next? What does that mean? We're going to get something called a points-based system, which anyone who's been studying immigration for more than a few minutes would know that actually we already had. We already had a points-based system. It had just been paused temporarily. So we're going to move from free movement and mobility of European citizens to an immigration solution. Now, various people have argued that that will lead to a black market in cheap labour, because companies and businesses in the UK rely on a lot of cheap European labour, which I wouldn't call low-skilled, I would call low-paid labour. And so the argument is that if you restrict that supply, you're going to create a black market, and that is going to lead to exploitation and abuse of those workers and modern slavery. So the question I'm posing is, are we really sliding from free movement into a system of immigration that will inevitably lead to a system of modern slavery for a large number of people? So that's the question. My answer to that question is yes and no. I wouldn't give you a straightforward yes or a straightforward no. It's a bit of both. I've worked in this area for many years, looking at victims of human trafficking, and many of those victims were European Union citizens with full mobility rights. So their rights to work and live in the UK did not prevent them from being exploited. Likewise, others were part of the immigration system and were exploited thanks to the vulnerabilities of not having secure status. So not having secure status does render you more vulnerable, but the growing category amongst those victims were British citizens. So actually being an immigrant or being a European citizen wasn't the only reason you were going to be exploited. So I don't think it's natural to say that the 3+ million European citizens who are now going to find their rights reduced are automatically going to be shifted into a system of modern slavery. For me, actually, the real loss is that idea of free movement. It's the idea that we can talk about mobility without the language of immigration. Because the language of immigration is a conditional language of hospitality. It's a conditional language of, you can be here if or but, as long as you behave yourself, as long as you don't have a criminal record, as long as you work, as long as you're profitable to the economy. So that language of immigration is the thing that we're now moving towards, away from the language of rightful residence and free movement and equality amongst European citizens. That, for me, is the real loss. And it's that language of immigration which is reductive, dehumanizing, where the only positive argument for immigrants is that they make us money. There's no human argument amongst politicians, I'm afraid, of all stripes. So what's the answer? The government's answer is the EU settlement scheme, which we heard about just now. So that is granting indefinite leave to those who get this thing called settled status. So in a way, that's the government's answer to the problem I posed at the beginning. What happens when you reduce the rights for 3+ million people? Well, the results as of 31st of December 2019 were that 2.7 million applications have been received, and that is seen as a massive success for the government. But other people would disagree. Out of that 2.7 million, only 58% were actually granted settled status. 41% were granted something called pre-settled status, which means actually they're going to have to apply again, and that status is temporary. It's not indefinite leave. It's not permanent indefinite leave. And moreover, the decision-making process is run by an algorithm, which in the FT recently was found to be discriminatory against, guess who? Women. Yeah. So we've got a problem with the way the decisions are being made. We've got a problem with the small percentage which won't get settled status because they either don't understand the scheme. I mean, I think it's great the work that you're doing to try and improve communication of this issue, but the chances are we won't get 100%. We just simply won't. There's no evidence that these sort of systems manage to get 100%. And more than 1 million with pre-settled status will have to go again. And likewise, the decision-making, just like all Home Office decision-making, is less than satisfactory. In fact, 90% of appeals have been successful against the Home Office. So that compares with things like the asylum system, where more than half the appeals against the Home Office are successful. So the problem is a perception-reality gap. So the politicians can claim that the settled status system is a solution, and that we don't have a problem with moving to this immigration solution to European citizens. I would argue that the language of immigration is wrong, and is definitely a step backwards. But also, you know, these 3.6 million, we think, European citizens living in the UK all have families. They've all made their homes here. And actually, under the new immigration rules, they would not be allowed in. The new immigration rules do not fit the reality of society that we now have. So that's why I say there's a perception-reality gap. The immigration system does not fit the society it's meant to apply to. And anyone who's been affected by this, who has family members who are EU citizens, who are European citizens themselves, know exactly how this is felt. This is felt that we're not welcome. It's felt that there are increasing levels of insecurity, increasing levels of discrimination and abuse. Whether that's real or not, it's a feeling. It's a sense that you immediately get as soon as you speak to people who are affected. So these are real effects, and these will have important implications for the way people behave, the way people decide what they do about where they live, where they work, and directly impact on their health and their well-being. So, going back to the question, what will happen? What happens when you shift from free movement to immigration? What happens when you remove or you reduce rights for 3 million people? In some ways, we could argue it's a grand experiment or a terrible experiment. But actually, I think we can have a good guess as to what will happen, because it's been done before, and it's been done before in the United Kingdom. You could argue it's a taste of things to come. We've already heard about the removal of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Now there's talk about leaving the Council of Europe and European Court of Human Rights. So potentially this is something that's going to happen to all of us. We're all going to have our rights reduced. But you only have to look back to the 1960s, when rights were reduced for a whole vast swathe of people under the Commonwealth Immigration Act. And this introduced various complications to citizenship that meant that for certain people, generally who weren't white, you had a reduced level of rights. Your citizenship was downgraded. So as with our current situation, the 60s laws to reduce rights effectively increased the state's powers over certain groups of people, increased their vulnerability, increased the ability to deport them, and did this without any sort of anti-discrimination legislation. So shorn of these rights, these groups were left to the mercy of market forces, and in the words of an academic called Carter, this effectively constituted black workers as a form of unfree wage labour. What we saw was a radical sort of vulnerabilisation, if you like, of a group of workers, which meant they became the new underclass, the new cheap labour that the economy is so much addicted to. And we all know the extent of the task to repair that damage. There were various attempts through anti-discrimination legislation in the last few decades. But Windrush demonstrated the failure of that legislation or any attempts to repair the damage done in the 1960s. So, to conclude on this happy tale, the immigration system, European freedom of movement, I would argue race, class, gender, these are all instruments used to manipulate and maintain a hierarchical system that is dependent on unfree labour. You can call it modern slavery, you can call it forced labour, you can call it unfree labour. The language of immigration is a dead end if we want to forge any sort of progressive way out of this. Free movement offered a possibility of a different way of talking about mobility. And I think no matter how progressive you want to sound on immigration, just using the language of immigration means that you've lost the argument. So I don't know how I'm doing for time. I've probably got a minute or two. Just to conclude, where are we? We're in the northwest of England. When you look around this country, how was it built and who was it that built it? The canals and bridges and roads were built by the Irish. And now we have free movement with Ireland, which is probably one of the last bastions of free movement. The welfare state was built and run by Commonwealth citizens. Our current service-led sector of cafes on every corner is run by European citizens. We simply live in an economy that is dependent on cheap labour. Now, the question and the suggestion of the government that employers should wean themselves off cheap labour through this immigration system that will only provide the brightest and best over a certain threshold and demanding English language as a condition is simply pie in the sky. What we need is recognition of everyone's rights to be here and everyone's rights to be treated equally. Now, I don't think it's wrong to have jobs that are, at the lower end of the labour market, as long as we have social mobility, as long as we have the right for everyone to move up the ladder. The shift from free movement to immigration, I fear, will not necessarily lead to 3 million people in modern slavery, but it will create damage that may take an entire generation to repair. That's where I end. Apologies for the negative finish.